The fire crackled in the heart of the village, sending thin trails of smoke toward the starry sky. The elders sat in a circle, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Their voices were low, grave, speaking of things that lurked beyond the trees. Kay listened from the shadows, arms crossed. He had heard the stories since he was a child, but tonight, something was different. The air carried a weight, a hush of expectancy. "The woman has called again," Tupin, the village's eldest, murmured. His eyes, milky with age, reflected the fire's light. Ubrajara heard her voice, and now he is gone. A murmur spread through the crowd. Kay clenched his jaw. Ubrajara was his friend. They had hunted together, laughed together. But now, just like the others before him, he had vanished. "We have warned you all," Tupin continued. "When you hear the voice calling your name, you must never answer." His wrinkled fingers clenched his wooden staff. "She does not seek conversation. She seeks faces. She seeks identity." Kay exhaled, shaking his head. "With all due respect, Elder, it makes no sense. If there were someone out there stealing faces, we would have seen her." Tupin turned his gaze toward him, his expression unreadable. And yet, those who see her never return the same. A tense silence settled. The elders exchanged glances. Then, one of the hunters, Tupinamba, stepped forward. "Kay speaks with reason," he said, arms folded. "If Ubrajara vanished, we should go into the forest and find him, not cower in fear." A few men nodded in agreement. Kay met Tupinamba's gaze, a silent pact forming between them. Tupin said, "Foolish boys, you may not believe, but the forest does not care." Kay straightened. "Then let me prove it. I'll stand guard tonight, outside the village. If she calls, I won't answer." Gasps rippled through the gathering. "You play a dangerous game, child," Tupin warned. "You cannot see what she is until it's too late." Kay held his ground. "Then I'll keep my eyes open." No one spoke after that. The fire burned lower. And in the silence of the night, somewhere beyond the trees, the wind carried something that almost sounded like a whisper. A name. His name. The night was thick with silence. Even the insects, usually a chorus of chirping and buzzing, seemed to have disappeared. Kay sat by the edge of the village, his spear resting across his lap, eyes fixed on the forest ahead. Tupinamba stood a few steps away, leaning against a tree with his arms crossed. The other warriors had refused to join them, muttering about spirits and curses. But Tupinamba was like Kay, unafraid of ghost stories. "The old ones let their fears shape their world," Tupinamba muttered, glancing at the trees. "If Ubrajara disappeared, it wasn't because of some woman without a face. Maybe he got lost. Maybe an animal took him." Kay nodded but said nothing. He wanted to believe that too. Then, the wind changed. A cold gust moved through the trees, making the leaves rustle in waves. Kay stiffened. The air smelled different, damp, almost metallic. And then he heard it. A voice. Soft. Sweet. Distant. "Kay." He froze. It was not shouted. It was not whispered. It simply existed, inside the night itself, inside his mind. He turned his head slowly toward Tupinamba. The warrior stood upright now, tense. His breathing had changed. Then the voice came again. "Tupinamba." Kay felt his stomach twist. The sound wasn't coming from anywhere specific. Not from the trees, not from behind them, not from above. It was everywhere and nowhere. Tupinamba exhaled sharply and took a step forward. "Who's there?" he called out. A crack of branches. A rustle in the undergrowth. Kay's heart pounded. Tupinamba stepped further ahead. "Don't answer," Kay hissed, grabbing his arm. Tupinamba pulled away. "It's someone playing tricks," he muttered, squinting into the darkness. Then the scream came. It was not human. A piercing, twisted wail erupted from the trees, sending a chill straight into Kay's bones. It rose higher and higher, until it became too loud, too unnatural, a sound that had no business existing in this world. Tupinamba dropped to his knees, clutching his head. His body convulsed. His breath came in ragged gasps. Kay wanted to move, but something inside him screamed not to run. And then silence. Tupinamba lifted his head. His eyes were wide, staring past Kay, past the village, into nothingness. Kay grabbed his shoulders. "Tupinamba." The warrior blinked. A shudder ran through his body, and his lips parted, but no words came out. Then slowly, he raised his arm and pointed toward the trees. Kay followed his gaze. Something moved between the trunks. A shadow. A figure. A woman. She was standing there, just beyond the torchlight of the village. where the darkness swallowed her form. She did not move. She did not breathe. She was watching them. K's pulse pounded in his ears. Tupanamba's body was trembling violently. His fingers dug into K's arm with an unnatural force. His lips moved as if trying to form words, but only a weak rasp came out. K tore his gaze away from the woman and shook him. "We need to go." Tupanamba barely reacted. K looked back at the trees. The woman was gone. The only thing left was the silence, and the feeling that something terrible had just begun. K dragged Tupanamba back toward the village, his heart pounding against his ribs. The warrior's weight was heavy, his steps sluggish, as if his body no longer belonged to him. The village torches flickered ahead. For a brief moment, K felt safe. They had made it back. But then he noticed something wrong. Tupanamba's grip on his arm had loosened. K turned to look at him. His friend stood still, completely rigid, his eyes locked on the ground. K followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt. Not theirs. Not anyone's from the village. Bare feet, small and delicate, leading away from them, toward the forest. K's blood ran cold. The prints were fresh. They hadn't been there when they arrived. A cold breeze brushed against his skin. The air felt thinner. The world around him distant, unreal. He reached out to shake Tupanamba's shoulder, but the warrior did not respond. His body was stiff, unyielding. His breath came in shallow gasps. And then K saw his shadow move in the wrong direction. Panic surged through him. He spun, looking around, expecting to see something behind them. Nothing. Just the trees. The dark. The footprints leading nowhere. A whisper stirred the air, barely audible. K grabbed Tupanamba's arm and ran. They reached the center of the village in gasping breaths. The fire still burned, and the elders were awake, watching. Tupan stepped forward, his expression dark. He already knew. K turned to Tupanamba, shaking him. "Say something." The warrior blinked slowly. His lips parted. His mouth formed words, but no sound came out. Tupan exhaled, closing his eyes. "It has begun." K's stomach clenched. "What are you talking about?" The elder motioned to Tupanamba. "Look at him, K. Really look at him." K did, and for the first time he saw it. Something was missing. Not physically. Tupanamba still looked like himself. But his eyes, they were empty. Not blank, not dull, empty. As if something had reached inside and taken whatever made him him. K took a step back. What's happening to him? Tupan's face was grim. She has already taken a part of him. He saw her. K clenched his fists. "We both saw her." Tupan shook his head. "No, you only glimpsed." He met her gaze. The elder turned to the fire, throwing more wood into the flames. Sparks crackled, lighting up the deep lines on his face. "By dawn," he said, "he will no longer be Tupanamba." K felt a sharp chill crawl up his spine, because when he turned back to his friend, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Tupanamba was smiling, but it was not his smile, and his shadow wasn't moving with the firelight anymore. K took a step back, his breath caught in his throat. The fire's glow flickered over Tupanamba's face, casting shadows that didn't belong. The smile remained, empty, unnatural, wrong. "Tupanamba," K whispered, gripping his friend's shoulder. The warrior blinked, slow and mechanical. His head tilted slightly, as if registering his own name for the first time. Then he spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was layered, soft, whispering, echoing, like many voices speaking through him at once. "She is waiting." K jerked his hand away, his pulse thundering. Tupan stepped forward, his grip firm on his staff. "Take him inside. He must not see the forest." Two warriors rushed in, seizing Tupanamba by the arms. He did not resist. He simply let them pull him away, his unmoving smile still plastered on his face. K turned to Tupan. "What is happening to him?" The elder's eyes were dark. "She has touched him, and now she is inside." K shuddered. "Inside." Tupan exhaled slowly, staring into the flames. "She does not steal faces, K. She steals what makes you you." He turned to him. "Tupanamba's body is here. But the person he was? She has already begun to take it." A heavy silence hung between them. K swallowed hard. "Can we stop it?" Tupan's lips pressed into a thin line. "We have until dawn." K clenched his fists. He would not let his friend disappear like Uberjara. The hours dragged painfully slow. Inside one of the huts, Tupanamba sat motionless, his hands resting on his knees. He did not blink unless someone reminded him to. Kay stood by the entrance, spear in hand. He would not let Tupinamba out of his sight. And yet something was wrong. The hut was too quiet. Kay turned to the others inside, 3 warriors assigned to guard Tupinamba. They weren't moving. A chill ran down his spine. "Tupin," he called out, stepping back. No one answered. Kay reached for his knife and crouched near Tupinamba. His friend's skin was paler now, his breathing shallow. And then a whisper in the air. Not from outside. From inside the hut. Kay turned sharply. The 3 warriors were still seated, but their shadows stretched toward Tupinamba, bending unnaturally, like reaching hands. He stepped forward, reaching out to shake one of them, and then all the torches went out. Darkness swallowed the hut, and in that darkness, Kay saw her. A shape, impossibly still, standing in the farthest corner. Not moving, not breathing, just watching. His own breath caught in his throat. His body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't, because she was already too close. A whisper brushed against his ear. "Now you see." Kay gasped, stumbling backward. His skin turned ice cold. She was right in front of him now. Even in the darkness, he could feel her. Her absence of a face. Her presence of something else. Something that should not exist. His mind screamed. And then, light. The torches flared back to life. Kay gasped for air, his heart slamming against his chest. The warriors were still there. Tupinamba was still there. And she was gone. But Kay knew the truth now. She was never gone. She was inside. Inside the night. Inside the silence. Inside him. Kay staggered outside, gulping the cold night air. His hands trembled, his mind reeled. She had been there. Not a shadow, not a hallucination. Something real, something watching. Tupin was waiting by the fire, his expression grim. "You saw her, didn't you?" Kay's mouth was dry. He could still feel the whisper against his skin. "She was inside the hut," he rasped. I couldn't move." Tupin nodded as if he had heard this before. "She doesn't need to touch you to take you." He stared into the flames. "Once you see her, she is already inside." Kay's stomach twisted. He glanced back at the hut. Tupinamba was still inside, unmoving. "I won't let him become like Uberajara." His voice was firm, but a sliver of doubt crept in. What if it was already too late? Tupin exhaled. The old stories say she was once human, a woman who defied the spirits, who demanded their power. In punishment, they took her face, her identity, her very being. But the spirits underestimated her. Kay listened, his heartbeat slowing. "She learned how to survive," Tupin continued. "She steals from others. Their memories, their faces, their names." His eyes darkened. "And once she takes enough, she becomes whole again, for a time. Until she must take more." A deep chill settled in Kay's bones. "How do we stop her?" Tupin's silence was answer enough. Kay clenched his fists. There had to be a way. Then, from inside the hut, a soft scraping sound. Kay and Tupin turned sharply. The warriors guarding Tupinamba stood frozen, staring at him. He was standing now, his head tilted slightly, his lips curling in a slow, eerie smile. Kay's heart pounded. Tupinamba took a single step forward, then another. And when he spoke, it wasn't his voice anymore. "She is still hungry." Kay's grip tightened around his spear as Tupinamba took another step forward. His smile remained, but his eyes, they were no longer his. They were hollow, depthless, like staring into a void. The warriors who had been guarding him took slow steps back, their faces pale. No one dared to speak. Tupin's voice came, low and firm. "Tupinamba, can you hear me?" The thing wearing his face laughed. Not Tupinamba's laugh. Something else. Something layered, stretched, unnatural. "She is waiting," the voice murmured through his lips. "She is always waiting." Kay felt cold sweat run down his back. "You're not him." Tupinamba's head tilted, his body twitching slightly, as though adjusting to his own limbs. Then suddenly, he moved too fast. 1 second he was standing still, the next he was inches from Kay, his face too close, too wrong. "You can stop this," he whispered, his breath chilling Kay's skin. Kay's entire body tensed. "How?" The creature inside Tupinamba smiled wider. "Give her another name." A sickening realization crashed over Kay. It wanted him to offer someone else in Tupinamba's place. A sacrifice. The warriors around him shifted uncomfortably. They had heard it too. And now the choice was real. Kay looked at Tupinamba, or the thing he had become. His friend was slipping away, piece by piece, devoured by something they barely understood. If Kay spoke a name, any name, it would be over. She would take someone else. The thought made him sick. Tupin stepped forward. "We do not bargain with spirits." His voice was calm, but Kay could see the tension in his shoulders. Tupinamba's head jerked slightly, like something inside was trying to break free. His lips curled in irritation. "Then he will be gone by dawn." K's pulse pounded. There had to be another way. "There is," the voice whispered, reading his thoughts. "But you won't survive it." The air grew heavy, suffocating. Kay felt something pressing into his chest, like invisible hands reaching through him, trying to pull something out. His breath caught. His mind fogged. He saw glimpses, faces without names, wandering through the forest, trapped in silence. And then another voice, weaker, struggling. "Kay, Tupinamba." The real Tupinamba. He was still there, buried beneath the thing that had taken hold of him. Kay had no time to think. His grip on the spear tightened. "I won't give a name." The thing in front of him hissed. Kay lunged. The moment the spear struck, the world collapsed. K's vision blurred. The hut vanished. The fire, the warriors, Tupin, all gone. He was somewhere else. Somewhere wrong. A vast, endless void. And in front of him, she stood waiting. Faceless. Formless. The woman. Kay couldn't move. His body wasn't his. Her voice was everywhere. "You belong to me now." The void closed in. And Kay realized. He was falling. Kay fell. Not through air, not through darkness. He fell through nothingness. The void had no beginning, no end, no ground to reach. It was a place that simply was, and he was trapped inside it. The woman was there. Everywhere. She had no face, no form, but Kay could feel her presence, wrapping around him like unseen hands. "You cannot fight me," her voice whispered through the void. "You have already lost." Kay clenched his teeth, fighting against the crushing weight pressing down on his chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet, Tupinamba had vanished. Uberjara had vanished. All the others before them had disappeared into this nothingness. Kay squeezed his eyes shut. No, he wouldn't surrender. Somewhere, buried in the depths of this void, Tupinamba was still there. Kay had heard his voice, weak but fighting. He reached out into the darkness, blindly searching. And then, something grabbed his hand. Not the woman. Not something monstrous. Tupinamba. His grip was weak, slipping, as though he were already half gone. But he was there. Kay held on tighter, pulling, dragging him back. "You're not hers," he growled. "Come back with me." The void trembled. The woman's voice turned into a low, distorted hum. "You do not get to leave." Kay ignored her. He pulled harder. A sudden force ripped through him, like 1,000 invisible knives slicing his skin. He screamed but didn't let go. Then, light. A burst of blinding light. Kay gasped, and he was back. He hit the ground hard, coughing, gasping for breath. The hut was still there. The fire still burned outside. The warriors stood, frozen in shock. Tupinamba collapsed beside him, his body trembling violently. Kay turned to look, really look, at him. His eyes weren't empty anymore. His face, his expression, it was his. Tupin stepped forward cautiously. "Is he?" Tupinamba groaned, blinking, and then he inhaled sharply. The weight lifted from K's chest. They had pulled him back. But then, something moved at the edge of the village. Kay turned his head, and for a brief, chilling moment, he saw her standing there. Silent, still, watching, then like mist in the wind. She was gone. But Kay knew. She was never really gone. The village was silent. Too silent. The warriors helped Tupinamba to his feet, though he swayed like a man waking from a nightmare. His breathing was ragged, his skin pale with cold sweat. Kay stood beside him, his legs unsteady. His body was back, but his mind, his soul, still felt trapped in that void. Tupin studied them both carefully. "You returned," he murmured, almost in disbelief. "No one has ever come back before." Kay swallowed hard. He could still feel her eyes on him, even though she was no longer there. But she was never truly gone, and he knew she would never stop. They kept Tupinamba inside a guarded hut for the rest of the night. The elders gathered outside, whispering, questioning if he was still the same man, if he was truly free. Kay sat near the fire, staring into the flames, barely hearing their voices. He should have felt relief. He had fought, pulled his friend back from the abyss. They had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. Because deep inside, Kay understood something terrible. The woman wasn't defeated. She hadn't disappeared. She had simply moved on. The first sign came before sunrise. A sharp wind howled through the village, carrying something with it. A sound so faint, so distant, Kay barely registered it at first. A whisper. Not his name this time. A child's name. Kay's head snapped up. He turned toward the nearest hut, where a young boy, no older than 8, stirred in his sleep. Then, the whisper came again. The boy moved, his lips parting, his face calm, unaware. And then, he whispered back. Kay was on his feet before he even realized it, rushing toward the hut. The elders tried to stop him, but he shoved past them, pushing through the cloth covering the entrance. The boy lay there, blinking slowly, staring at the ceiling. Kay's stomach twisted. It was already too late. The footprints had already appeared in the dirt outside the hut, leading toward the trees. A cold, hollow truth settled in Kay's chest. The cycle had begun again. And the woman, she had found someone new.